Colorado Territory, winter, 1877. $40 for the fat one, the man in the beaver hat called out, and the whole saloon laughed. Not nervous laughter, not the kind that fades quickly when people feel ashamed of themselves. The full, comfortable laughter of a crowd that had decided, collectively, that what was happening in front of them was entertainment rather than cruelty. Nora Beale stood on the wooden platform that had been used last Tuesday to auction a pair of draft horses. She knew this because the platform still smelled of horse and manure beneath the pine resin someone had rubbed over the boards in a half-hearted attempt at dignity. She was 24 years old, 5'5". Her figure was full in the way that Renaissance painters understood, and frontier men apparently did not. Wide hips, soft arms, a bosom that her stepfather had leered at since she was 16 and her mother had pretended not to notice. Her face was what people in Boston, where she had lived before her mother died, would have called beautiful without qualification. Dark auburn hair the color of mahogany in firelight. Eyes so green they looked invented. A mouth that was used to being pressed shut. It was pressed shut right now. Her stepfather, Caleb Beale of Pueblo, Colorado, a man who owed $400 to 3 separate creditors and had decided that his stepdaughter represented a solution, stood to the left of the platform with his arms crossed and the expression of a man conducting perfectly reasonable business. He had advertised her in the Colorado Territorial Gazette 2 weeks ago. Woman, 24, strong constitution, some schooling, available for frontier marriage. Inquire, G. Beale, Cold River Crossing. He had not asked her opinion. He had told her to wear her good dress and be ready at noon. She had worn the dress. Dark green wool, the last thing her mother had sewn before the consumption took her. She wore it because it was armor, because it had been made by hands that loved her. Because if she was going to be sold in a saloon in Colorado Territory in the year 1877, she was going to be sold looking like herself. "50, someone called from the back. "The fat ones work harder," another voice offered, helpfully, and there was more laughter. Nora counted the knots in the floorboard below her feet. 1, 2, 3. She had learned this from her schoolteacher mother. When the world becomes unbearable, find something to count, something real and solid and indifferent to human cruelty. 4, 5. "She cook?" the auctioneer asked Gerald. "Well enough." "She obedient?" Nora looked up from the floorboards at that, looked directly at the auctioneer with her green eyes, and something in her expression made the man take one small step backward without knowing why. That was when the door opened. Cold air came in first, the particular cold of the San Juan Mountains in November, the kind that carries ice crystals and the smell of pine resin and something older than any of them. Then the man himself filled the doorway, and the saloon went quieter without anyone deciding to be quiet. He was large, not in the puffed-up way of men who wanted to be noticed. Large the way old trees are large, simply, unapologetically, as a consequence of years and weather. 6'4", with shoulders that had clearly spent a decade carrying things that weighed more than most men could imagine. Dark hair going silver at the temples. A jaw that looked like it had been chiseled from the same granite that formed the mountains he lived in. And eyes, gray, still, watchful, that swept the room once and landed on Nora with an expression she had never seen on any face in her life. Not desire, not pity, not the calculating look of a man pricing livestock. Recognition. As if he had seen something in her face that he already understood. "What's the bid?" he said. His voice was quiet. It carried anyway. $60, the auctioneer said, recovering his salesman's confidence. "Fine figure of a woman, good working age, healthy." The man walked to the platform. He did not look at Gerald Beale. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at Nora, and he said something that no one in that room expected. "You want to leave?" Nora stared at him. "What?" "I'm asking you, not him." The gray eyes cut briefly to Gerald, then returned to her. "Do you want to leave this place?" The saloon was completely silent now. Nora looked at her stepfather, at the auctioneer, at the 30 men in that room who had been laughing 30 seconds ago. Then she looked at the stranger with the mountain gray eyes who had asked her a question that no one had thought to ask in 2 weeks. "Yes," she said. He put $80 on the platform, twice the highest bid, turned to Gerald Beale and said, "We're done here," in a voice that closed the conversation the way a door closes, fully, with finality, without violence, but without any possibility of argument. Then he held out his hand to help Nora down from the platform. His palm was calloused and warm. She took it. And her whole life changed in a saloon that smelled of horses and pine resin on a Tuesday in November, 1877. In Cold River Crossing, Colorado Territory. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. I want to know what corner of the world these old mountain stories reach. His name was Caleb Marsh. He had not been to Cold River Crossing in 4 months, which was normal for him. He came to town when he needed supplies, which was not often, because he had spent 10 years making himself need as little as possible. 4 months of salt pork and venison, and the particular silence of the San Juan Mountains at 11,000 feet, broken only by wind and the distant crack of winter ice in the ravines, and he had not noticed the silence, had not found it lacking, until lately. He was 38 years old. He owned 600 acres on the western ridge of the San Juan Range above the Uncompahgre River, land he had purchased with 10 years of trapping income and a small inheritance from a father he barely remembered, land that was beautiful in the bone-breaking, soul-stripping way of high country Colorado, land that asked more of a man than he sometimes had to give. He had built his cabin himself over 2 summers, with a precision that spoke of a man who put workmanship where other men put conversation. He had not intended to buy a woman at an auction in a saloon. He had come to Cold River Crossing for flour, coffee, and a new file for his wood saw. He had heard the noise from the saloon when he tied his horse, heard the laughter at a pitch and a timber that he recognized. Not the laughter of men enjoying themselves, but the laughter of men who had collectively decided that someone else's humiliation was permitted. He had walked in because that particular kind of laughter had a way of making him walk toward rather than away. He had seen Nora standing on that platform, and the first thing he had noticed was not what everyone else was noticing. He noticed her hands, clasped in front of her, white-knuckled but completely still, held together with the deliberate control of someone who would not allow them to shake, not here, not for these people. He had stood in his share of storms, blizzards, rock slides, the kind of mountain weather that has killed better men than him, and he knew what it looked like when a person decided to endure rather than break. He knew it from the inside. I want to say something about Gerald Beale before we go further, because men like him deserve to be understood rather than simply hated. In the winter of 1877, under Colorado territorial law, a stepfather held legal authority over an unmarried stepdaughter with no male relatives to challenge him. The records of Pueblo County from that year show 17 such arrangements filed quietly as labor contracts or domestic placements. 17 women. Most of them were never heard from again. The cruelest part was never the auction. The cruelest part was the law that made the auction legal. The ride out of Cold River Crossing took 3 hours. Nora sat on the wagon bench beside Caleb in a silence that was, she realized, different from the silence she'd expected. She had expected the silence of a man who had bought something and was now considering how to use it. What she got instead was the silence of a man who simply did not feel the need to fill space with words. He had handed her a heavy wool blanket without speaking, had adjusted her side of it when the wind picked up without being asked, had driven with his eyes on the road and his hands steady on the reins, with the patience of someone who had sat through worse weather than this for longer than most people could imagine. After an hour, she said, "Why did you ask me?" "What?" "In the saloon. You asked me if I wanted to leave. You didn't have to do that." Caleb was quiet for a moment. The horses picked their way along the canyon road, the red walls of the Uncompahgre Gorge rising on their left, the river below, steel gray and fast with snowmelt. "Seemed like a reasonable question," he said finally. "No one else thought so?" "No." A pause. They weren't going to be living with the answer. Nora looked at the side of his face. The strong jaw, the silver at his temples, the way his eyes stayed on the road with a steadiness that she was beginning to understand was simply how he was, not performing calm, actually calm, the way a mountain is calm. "What are your expectations?" she asked. She had decided on the platform that if she survived this, she would never again fail to ask the direct question. Caleb turned to look at her for the first time since they'd left town. The gray eyes were level, unguarded. "A cook," he said. "Someone to manage the house. I'm up at 4, working until dark. I don't have time for the domestic side, and I'm not good at it. The cabin's clean, but it's not a home. It's where a man sleeps." A beat. "Your own room, your own space. I won't touch you without an invitation, and I don't expect one." Nora considered this. "That's it?" "That's it." "You paid $80 for a cook." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite amusement, but related to it. "I paid $80 so that man couldn't sell you to someone worse." The wagon rounded a bend and the mountains opened ahead of them, the San Juans in November, white-capped and enormous and indifferent to everything below, the sky above them a blue so deep it looked solid. Nora had grown up in Boston, had moved to Pueblo after her mother married Caleb Beale, had never in her life seen country this vast or this empty. It should have felt like a threat, like the world swallowing her. Instead, sitting on that wagon bench with a blanket around her shoulders and a man who had asked her permission before changing her life, it felt like something she had no word for yet. It takes a particular kind of courage to accept kindness when you've learned to expect cruelty. Not the courage of soldiers or pioneers, the quieter, harder kind. The courage of deciding, after everything, to trust the evidence in front of you rather than the pattern inside you. Ask yourself, how many times have you turned away from something good because it came in an unexpected shape? The cabin sat at 10,200 feet on the western ridge of the San Juan Mountains, above a valley the trappers had named Widow's Creek for reasons that Caleb, in the course of 3 hours of nearly total silence, declined to explain. The road up was 2 miles of switchbacks cut into granite, wide enough for a single wagon, bordered on the left by a rock face and on the right by a drop into the pine forest below that Nora judged at approximately catastrophic Caleb drove it without slowing down, which told her either that he was reckless or that he had driven it often enough to have memorized every stone. The horses knew the way. She could tell by how they leaned into the curves without being guided, the easy forward lean of animals going home. The pine forest thickened as they climbed. The trees up here were not the friendly, park-like pines of lower elevations. These were old-growth Engelmann spruce, massive and dark, their lower branches dead and gray, their canopies so thick the late afternoon light came through in shafts that moved and shifted like something alive. The snow beneath them was untouched. No tracks, no footprints. Nothing had passed here since the last storm. "Do you get many visitors?" Nora asked. "No." "By choice?" He thought about this longer than she expected. "Partly," he said. The cabin materialized from the trees the way the good things in this country seem to materialize. Without announcement, simply there, solid and permanent as the rock it had been built against. It was larger than she'd expected. 2 chimneys, a covered porch running the full width of the front, a barn set back and to the right, connected to the main house by a covered walkway that she understood immediately was a very intelligent design choice for a place that got serious snow. Caleb pulled the wagon up and stopped. He climbed down, came around to her side. He did not offer his hand this time. He waited. She climbed down herself, stood in the snow, 6 inches, light and dry, and looked at the cabin that was apparently her home now, and felt the full weight of the past 12 hours pressed down on her at once. The platform, the laughter, the $80, the 3 hours of mountain road, the man beside her who had spoken perhaps 40 words and somehow communicated more clearly than most people managed in a day. Her legs shook, just slightly. She locked them. "Come inside," Caleb said. "I'll get a fire started." Inside was better than outside. Not warm yet. The fire had been banked and the cabin had been empty for days. But the cold here was still and dry rather than savage. The main room was large, a stone fireplace on the north wall that Nora could have walked into standing up, a table of hand-cut pine, 4 chairs, a cast-iron stove in the kitchen corner, shelves along the east wall with a careful organization that told her he had a system for everything and did not deviate from it. A rocking chair beside the fireplace. Beside the rocking chair, a small table with an oil lamp and a book, its spine so worn she couldn't read the title. He crouched at the fireplace, had it going in under 3 minutes, which told her this was not something he had to think about. The smell of pine smoke filled the room, then heat, moving outward in a slow wave. Nora stood in the middle of the floor with her small bag at her feet and looked around at the life she was going to inhabit and made a decision that she had been moving toward since the moment he asked her, "Do you want to leave?" She was going to be here, really here. Not surviving this like she'd survived Gerald's house, moving through rooms as invisibly as possible, taking up as little space as she could manage. She was going to exist in this place fully and see what happened. "Your room's through there," Caleb said, without turning from the fire. "Small, but it has a window that faces east. Gets the morning light." "Thank you." He stood up, turned, met her eyes briefly. "There's venison stew in the pot on the back of the stove, from 2 days ago. Should still be good. I'll see to the horses." He put his coat back on and went out, closing the door quietly behind him. Nora stood alone in Caleb Marsh's cabin for the first time, looked at the fire, at the book beside the rocking chair, at the shelves organized with the meticulous precision of a man who had been alone long enough to make systems, because systems were the only company that didn't leave. She went to check the stew. It was venison and root vegetables, thickened with a handful of flour, seasoned with salt and dried sage. Simple, solid. The cooking of a man who ate to live and had never had anyone to cook for. She tasted it, added black pepper from the shelf, found dried rosemary in a small jar and added that too. Put the lid back on and let it warm. When Caleb came in from the barn 40 minutes later, stamping snow from his boots, the cabin smelled different. The stew had been remade from good to something else. He stopped just inside the door. He didn't say anything, but he took off his coat more slowly than usual, hung it with more care, as if he was giving himself time to adjust to something he hadn't expected. The first week taught Nora things that no amount of Boston schooling had prepared her for. She learned that at 10,200 feet, water boiled at a lower temperature, which meant bread took longer to rise and required more yeast. She learned this by destroying 2 loaves before Caleb, watching from the doorway with the patient expression of a man who had been through worse failures than bread, said, "The altitude. Everything takes longer up here." She learned that the wood stove was a living thing with opinions and moods. Feed it wrong and it sulked and smoked. Feed it right, the specific combination of dry pine kindling, a split of aspen for quick heat, a log of Gamble oak for the long burn, and it hummed with a contentment that was almost companionable. In frontier households of the Colorado high country in the 1870s, a wood stove consumed nearly 1.5 cords of firewood each week through winter, roughly 192 cubic feet of split wood, and a woman who could not manage a wood stove was a woman who could not survive. It was not a domestic skill, it was survival knowledge dressed in an apron. She learned the geography of the cabin without being taught it. Which floorboards creaked and which were silent. Which window let in a draft when the wind came from the northwest. The particular sound the roof made when snow was accumulating, a slow, dense settling, versus the sound it made when the wind was simply throwing weather against it. She learned Caleb. Not quickly. He was not a man who revealed himself quickly. But she was a woman who had spent years in a house where survival required reading people accurately, and so she paid attention to the things he didn't say. He left coffee on the stove before she woke in the morning. This was the first thing she noticed. Not a grand gesture. He simply made enough for 2 and kept it warm and didn't mention it. The first day she had assumed it was excess. By the 3rd day she understood it was deliberate. He brought wood to the house himself rather than having her carry it. Not all of it. She insisted on carrying her share, and he accepted this without argument, which she appreciated. But the first load of the day was always already inside when she came downstairs. She never saw him do it. He fixed the draft in her bedroom window on the 2nd day, working with putty and a thin strip of rawhide, efficiently and without being asked, because he had noticed the cold corner of the room and reached the conclusion that it needed addressing without needing to be told. He did not talk at meals. She had expected this to be uncomfortable. It wasn't. The silence at his table was not the hostile silence of Gerald Beale's house, the silence that was really a threat, but simply the quiet of a man who was present without performing presence. He ate with attention. He looked at his food, or at the window, or occasionally at her, with the steady gray gaze that she was beginning to understand was not scrutiny, but simply how he looked at things he found worth looking at. On the 4th evening, she found the book from beside his rocking chair on the kitchen table, set near her place. She hadn't mentioned books or reading. She picked it up. The complete works of Shakespeare, the pages soft with use. She opened to a dog-eared page, King Lear. The margins had notes in handwriting that was careful and considered, a man working through ideas with a pencil. She sat down and began to read. When she looked up an hour later, Caleb was in the rocking chair, watching her with an expression she had no category for. Not desire, something quieter, something that looked, if she had to name it, like relief. She pretended she hadn't noticed, but she knew. I believe, and I'm willing to be argued with about this, that the most intimate thing two people can do is not what most love stories suggest. It is the moment when you show someone what you love. Not your best self, not your brave self. The self that has a dog-eared copy of Shakespeare in a cabin above 10,000 feet and has never shown it to another person because you learned at some point that the things you love most are the things that can be taken from you. That moment of showing, that is the crossing of a line. Everything after that is just details. By the end of the second week, the cabin had changed. Not dramatically. Caleb was not a man who would have tolerated dramatic change, but in small, significant ways. There was a clay pot of dried grasses on the kitchen windowsill. Nora had found them under the snow near the tree line, preserved somehow, their dried heads still holding shape. Nothing decorative about them, really, but the window looked different with them there. There were 2 cups on the table at breakfast, rather than one appearing later as an afterthought. Caleb had started talking more at meals. Not much, but more than silence. He asked questions, direct, specific questions that showed he had been paying attention. What did you study in school? Do you know anything about horses? What do you think of the altitude now that you've been up here a while? He listened to the answers with the focused attention of a man for whom listening was not passive but active, a skill he had developed because it mattered to him to understand things correctly. She asked him questions back. How had he come to this particular place? What did he grow in the kitchen garden she could see buried under snow, waiting for spring? Had he built everything in this cabin himself? Yes, to the last one. Yes, to almost all of it. He had spent 2 summers building this place from cut timber and river stone, and a precision that was visible in every joint and corner. He had built it for permanence, for the kind of life that stayed in one place and went deep rather than wide. "Did you ever want to leave?" she asked one evening. "Go somewhere else?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "I did leave," he said, "once. Went back east for a year after my wife died. Thought maybe I thought a different place would help." Nora set down her cup. "Your wife?" 11 years ago. The winter of 1866. Fever. He said it the way people name old injuries, not without pain, but with the economy of pain that has been examined many times and is now part of the architecture of the person. We'd been here 2 years. She loved it, actually, which surprised everyone who knew her. What was her name? Eleanor. She sounds like she had good taste, Nora said carefully. In places. Something moved across his face, almost a smile. She did. He stood, collected the cups, moved to the stove. His back was to her when he spoke again. "I went east, and it didn't help. The different place just had different silences. Came back here because at least these silences were mine." Nora looked at the back of his shoulders, at the way he stood at the stove with the particular posture of a man who had made peace with something large and difficult, not perfectly, but sustainably. She understood this. She had made her own peace with things large and difficult. The difference was that hers had hardened her in ways she could feel, like scar tissue over a joint, functional, but not quite right. His had made him quieter. She was beginning to wonder which was better. The rider came on a Thursday in late December. Nora saw him from the kitchen window, a dark shape moving up the switchback road with the deliberate pace of a man who was riding with purpose but not urgency. She felt her stomach drop before she could see his face clearly. She knew the shape of that particular purposefulness. She had seen it in bailiffs, in lawyers, in men who carried other people's authority like a weapon. Caleb was in the barn. He came out when he heard the horse. The rider was a young man, not yet 20, with a face that wanted to apologize for what he was doing, but didn't quite manage it. He was wearing a deputy's badge from Pueblo County. He handed Caleb a folded document without getting off his horse. Caleb read it. His face did not change. This, Nora had learned, meant something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked from the porch. Caleb folded the paper and looked at the deputy. "You need a reply?" "Within 30 days, sir. The court requires—" "I know what the court requires. Not harsh, just final. Tell them I'll respond." The deputy turned his horse and rode back down the mountain with the relief of a man who had completed an errand he'd been anxious about. Caleb brought the paper inside, set it on the table. Nora sat down and read it. Gerald Beale of Pueblo, Colorado, was petitioning the territorial court to void the arrangement made at Cold River Crossing on the grounds that Caleb Marsh had purchased her without a proper marriage contract, and that under Colorado territorial law, an unmarried woman of no independent means remained the ward of her nearest male relative unless a legal marriage had been performed. Gerald was requesting Nora's return, but that was not the worst of it. Attached to the petition was a second document, an affidavit from a man named Silas Greer, representing the Colorado Southern Railroad, expressing interest in 600 acres of mountain land in the San Juan High Country along the western ridge of the Uncompahgre watershed, land currently occupied by one Caleb Marsh for purposes of a proposed rail line through the mountains. The affidavit noted that Mr. Marsh had declined 2 previous purchase offers, and that the petitioner, Gerald Beale, had indicated a willingness to cooperate with the railroad's interests in exchange for financial consideration. Gerald had not come for Nora. He had come for the land. Nora was just the legal crowbar. She set the paper down. Caleb was at the window, looking out at the mountains with the expression of a man who was running calculations he didn't like. "You knew about the railroad," she said. "Not a question." "First offer came 2 years ago. Second offer 6 months ago. I said no both times." "Gerald must have found out and saw an opportunity." "Yes." A pause. "I'm sorry. I didn't know he'd—" "Don't apologize." She said it sharper than she intended. "He's been looking for ways to make money off me since I was 16 years old. This is just a new method." She straightened the papers, squared them with the edge of the table. "What does the court actually need to return me? What's the legal mechanism?" Caleb looked at her. "A finding that no valid marriage took place." "And if a valid marriage had taken place?" He was quiet for a long time. "Then Gerald would have no legal claim," he said carefully. "And the land?" "The land is mine regardless. But without you as leverage, Gerald has no reason to cooperate with Greer and the railroad. And without Gerald, Greer has no grounds to challenge my claim." Nora looked at him across the cabin, at the man who had spent 2 summers building this place, who had made coffee for 2 before there was a second person to drink it, who owned a dog-eared Shakespeare and had never shown it to anyone. "So, we have a problem," she said. "We have a problem," he agreed. There is a question underneath this moment that I think is worth sitting with. Nora knew exactly what she was being asked to consider. Not explicitly, not yet, but she knew. She was a 24-year-old woman who had been sold, brought to a mountain, and was now looking at a man who needed something from her. She had every right to see the pattern and refuse to participate. Every right to say, "I have been used as a means to an end by men my whole life, and I will not do it again." The question isn't whether she should trust Caleb Marsh. The question is whether she trusted herself. Whether the evidence she had gathered in 6 weeks, the coffee, the window putty, the Shakespeare, the question in the saloon, was enough to bet on. We all have to make that calculation eventually. How much evidence is enough to risk being wrong again? Silas Greer arrived 9 days later with 2 men and a surveying equipment case, and the particular confidence of someone who had never in his life been told no by anyone who mattered. He was 50 years old, immaculate in a wool coat that cost more than most men in Colorado Territory earned in a month, with silver-streaked hair and the practiced smile of a man who had learned to make acquisition look like generosity. He represented the Colorado Southern Railroad, which represented Eastern Capital, which represented, in 1877, something very close to the law. He rode up the switchback road at mid-morning and found Nora on the porch. She was there because she had seen him coming and had decided to be there rather than inside, which was the difference between meeting something and waiting for it. "Mrs. Marsh," he said pleasantly, because that was what they had decided. A letter to the court had been filed 3 days earlier from Caleb Marsh and his wife Nora, married October 1877, Cold River Crossing, Colorado. The justice of the peace had driven up the mountain himself, grumbling about the road, and had performed a ceremony that was brief and civil and, by the time Greer arrived, entirely legal and recorded. "Is your husband available?" "He is," Nora said, "but you can speak to me first." Greer's smile adjusted slightly. "Of course." "You want the land." "We'd like to discuss a purchase, yes." A very generous, "My husband said no twice." Nora folded her hands in front of her, the same way she had folded them on the auction platform, white-knuckled and completely still. "He'll say no a third time. The answer won't change because you brought surveyors." "Mrs. Marsh, I understand your loyalty to your husband, but you should know that the railroad has the legal authority to pursue eminent domain proceedings if—" "I know what eminent domain is," Nora said evenly. "I also know that it requires a public use determination by the territorial legislature, which has not been granted. I know that your survey rights require landowner consent unless you have a federal charter, which the Colorado Southern does not have. And I know that you were working with Gerald Beale of Pueblo to use me as legal leverage to pressure my husband, which—" She tilted her head slightly. "I'm sure you'd rather not have discussed in a court proceeding." Greer stared at her. The pleasant smile had gone somewhere else entirely. "Where did you—" "My mother was a school teacher," Nora said. "She taught me to read everything I could get my hands on, including territorial law." Caleb came around the side of the cabin from the barn. He had seen Greer coming too. He moved up beside Nora and stood there, not in front of her, not between her and Greer, but beside her, shoulder to shoulder, so that Greer was looking at both of them. "I believe my wife covered it," Caleb said quietly. One of Greer's men shifted in his saddle. The other was looking at Caleb with the careful attention of a man recalculating. "This isn't over, Mr. Marsh." "No," Caleb agreed. "But today it is." Greer turned his horse, rode back down the mountain with his surveyors and his leather case and his federal charter he didn't have, and the Colorado Southern Railroad found a different route through the San Juans that added 11 miles and cost the investors considerably more than they had planned. Gerald Beale, his leverage gone and his petition voided, was last seen in Pueblo attempting to borrow money from a man who owed him a previous debt. He was unsuccessful. Nora stood on the porch until the sound of the horses faded into the pine forest below. Then she sat down on the porch steps and put her face in her hands. Not crying, just breathing. The particular breathing of a person who has been holding themselves very tightly for an extended period and has finally been given permission to relax slightly. Caleb sat beside her on the step, close enough that his shoulder was against hers. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. After a while, he said, "You read territorial law." "I read everything in your shelves," she said into her palms. "You have a book on Colorado mining claims that has a chapter on land rights. I read it twice." Another silence. "You've been preparing for this since the letter came," he said. "Someone had to." True strength is not the absence of fear. Nora Beale had been terrified every second of that conversation. Her hands were shaking inside the stillness she showed. But she had done the preparation. She had read the books and learned the law, and stood on that porch and used what she knew. That is not rescue. That is not being saved. That is a woman using every tool she had ever been given and refusing to let the person she loved fight alone. Standing beside someone is not the same as standing behind them. That evening, the fire burned low and steady, and the cabin held the particular warmth of a place that had earned its heat. Nora sat in the rocking chair she had quietly claimed as her own over the past 6 weeks, a process Caleb had watched without comment and apparently approved of, with the Shakespeare open in her lap. She was not reading, she was looking at the fire. Caleb was at the table with his breeding records, the careful notation of a man who ran an operation alone and relied on his own records to remember what he couldn't hold in his head. He had a cup of coffee cooling beside him. He was not reviewing the records. He was also looking at the fire. After a long time, Nora said, "I want to stay." Caleb set down his pencil. "I know we made a legal arrangement, and that was necessary, and I'm not saying this because of Gerald or Greer or the land." She looked at the fire rather than at him because it was easier to say this to something that didn't look back. "I'm saying it because I have been in this place for 6 weeks, and it is the first place in my adult life where I have taken up the space I actually occupy. And I don't want to give that up." She heard him shift in his chair. "I mean," she stopped, tried again. "I am not a small person. I know that. I've spent a great deal of my life being managed and arranged and made to feel that my size was a problem to be worked around, that I was more than what was—" She stopped again. She was not going to cry in front of the fire about this. "In this cabin, I have not felt that way. Not once. And I don't know if that's you or the altitude, or both." Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then he got up, came to the fireplace, and crouched down in front of the fire rather than in front of her, maintaining a careful distance, not crowding. He looked at the flames. "When I saw you on that platform," he said slowly, "I saw a woman who had decided not to break. And I thought—" He stopped. "I've been up here 10 years making myself need less and less of everything. Less food, less warmth, less company. I got very good at it. And somewhere in the process I convinced myself that was strength. He looked at her. The firelight made his gray eyes amber. It isn't. It's just a different kind of giving up. Nora looked back at him, at the man who had asked her one question in a saloon, and then spent 6 weeks asking her questions with coffee and wood and Shakespeare and the careful, patient language of someone who had been alone so long he had forgotten how to use words for the important things. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Good," he said. And that was enough. For now. The important conversations, the ones that were still to come, about Eleanor, about her mother, about what a partnership between two people who had both learned to make themselves smaller actually looked like when neither of them did that anymore. Those conversations would happen. There was time. The fire popped. Wind moved through the spruce forest outside with the sound of something breathing. "Caleb," she said. "You can sit in the rocking chair if you want." "I know," he said. "I moved the other chair over for a reason." She looked. The second chair, she had not noticed this before, had been repositioned slightly, angled toward the fire, toward where she sat. Not far, a few inches, but deliberate. It had probably been there since the second week. She had not noticed because she had been so busy trying to take up only her assigned space that she had not looked for signs that more was being offered. She looked at it now. Then she looked at him. "Sit down, then," she said. He did. Home is not a place that already exists. Home is a place that two people build out of the small decisions they make every day. Where to put the chair, whose coffee to make, which questions to ask, and which silences to honor. It is not found. It is assembled, carefully, over time, from the material of who you actually are, rather than who you thought you needed to be. Some people spend their whole lives looking for a home that is already built. The braver ones find someone worth building with. Is the love between Nora and Caleb strong enough to survive what is still coming? The full Colorado winter, the scars they haven't yet shown each other, the ways that two people who learned to need nothing suddenly have everything to lose? Stay for the next story. I think you'll want to. Every comment I read from you reminds me that these old stories travel farther than I expect. Someone in a city I've never been to, listening at midnight, finding something in a woman on a Colorado mountain that speaks to something in their own life. That's not nothing. That's everything. Tell me where you're listening from tonight. Tell me if you've ever had to stand on a porch and fight for something with nothing but what you'd read in someone else's books. Tell me if you've ever been in a room that finally fit you. If you still believe there are people worth building something with, don't leave. The next story is for you. Caleb Marsh's cabin above Widow's Creek, San Juan Mountains, Colorado Territory, winter 1877. The altitude. Everything takes longer up here. And some things, when they finally arrive, are worth every foot of the climb.